Content warning. This episode discusses sexual assault, domestic and gender-based violence, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. On the morning of Friday, September the 4th, 1981, two boys woke up in their apartment in Lakeland, Florida, to find the place full of police officers. Jeff was 15. His younger brother, Tim, was 12. Neither of them had heard a single thing during the night. No struggle, no cry for help, nothing at all out of the ordinary in an apartment they shared with their mother, Linda. It was Linda's sister, Judy, who had made the discovery that brought the police to their door that morning, after noticing something wrong with the screen on Linda's bedroom window. It had been torn open from the outside. Inside, she found her sister dead. Linda Slaten was 31 years old, a single mother doing her best to raise two boys on her own. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with a wire coat hanger, pulled straight from the hangers in her own closet and twisted around her throat. Investigators worked that scene with everything they had. They lifted a partial palm print from the windowsill where the killer had climbed in. They collected a rape kit, preserving evidence that, in 1981, science simply didn't yet know what to do with. And for the two boys sleeping down the hall that night, an even stranger, crueler twist to this story was still years away from being understood. Because for most of their childhoods, the man they trusted most outside their own family, the coach who drove one of them to and from football practice, who stood right behind him in the team photo hanging on his bedroom wall, was the same man who had killed their mother. It would take 38 years and a piece of forensic science that didn't exist when Linda Slaten died to finally prove it. Part 1, a life built for her sons Linda Patterson Slaten, was, by the accounts of the people who loved her, a woman defined by resilience. In 1981, she was 31 years old, raising her two sons, Jeff and Tim, largely on her own in Lakeland, Florida. Money was tight. The family lived, for a period, in government-assisted housing, getting by on welfare while Linda worked to build something more stable for her boys. It wasn't an easy life, but by every account, her family has given in the decades since. It was one Linda approached with real determination and warmth. At Linda's eventual sentencing hearing for her killer, held, extraordinarily, more than 40 years after her death, her son Jeff would describe her plainly and without embellishment. She was a good person. It was rough, he said, living on government housing and welfare, but she was doing the best she could for her family. It's a simple, unpretentious description, and it says everything about the kind of mother Linda Slaten was trying to be. Not glamorous, not easy, just steady and present, doing right by two boys who depended on her. Linda's sister, Judy Butler, was a close part of that support system, someone who checked in on Linda and the boys regularly. It would be Judy who, on the morning of the 4th of September, 1981, would make the discovery that changed everything. And in Tim's life specifically, there was another adult who had, by 1981, become an important and trusted presence. His youth football coach, a man named Joseph Clinton Mills, known to Tim and to plenty of other kids on that team, simply as Coach Joe. Mills had a habit of driving Tim home from practice, an ordinary act of kindness from a coach to a kid on his team, the kind of small, everyday generosity that builds real trust between an adult and a child over the course of a season. Tim looked up to him. He was proud enough of that connection to hang a team photo on his bedroom wall, Coach Joe standing directly behind him, smiling for the camera, exactly where a proud, supportive coach belongs in a kid's memory of that year. None of the Slatens had any reason, in 1981, to think of Joseph Mills as anything other than exactly what he appeared to be. Part 2. The night of September 3rd, on the 3rd of September, 1981, Coach Joe drove Tim home after football practice, just as he had many times before. According to what Mills would eventually tell police, years and years later, Once the truth finally caught up with him, he dropped Tim off at the apartment, and Linda came out to the car to thank him for the ride. It's worth pausing on how mundane that moment sounds, because it's precisely that ordinariness that makes the rest of this story so unsettling. A mother thanking her son's coach for a lift home. The most unremarkable interaction imaginable between two adults who, by every account, had built up an entirely normal, trusting relationship through their shared connection to Tim. According to Mills's own account, given to investigators decades later, he then left and, in his telling, never returned. That was, for close to 4 decades, essentially where the official record of his involvement in that evening ended, as far as anyone outside of Joseph, Mills himself knew. But sometime after Tim and Jeff had gone to sleep that night, someone climbed in through the torn screen of Linda's bedroom window. What happened next left Linda Slaten dead by morning, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a wire coat hanger taken directly from her own closet, twisted around her neck as she lay in her bed. Neither Jeff nor Tim heard anything. Not a struggle, not a cry, nothing that pulled either boy from sleep that night. It's one of the case's more haunting, quietly devastating details. 2 children sleeping just down the hall from their mother while she was murdered, with no warning and no chance to help, waking up the next morning to a home full of police instead. Part 3. The scene. The officer who led the crime scene investigation that morning was Sergeant Edgar Pickett, a fingerprint specialist with the Lakeland Police Department, who would go on to become something of a legend within that department. Respected enough, in fact, that the department's crime lab would eventually be named in his honor. Decades later, speaking to journalists as a man in his 90s, Pickett could still describe the scene with total, unnervingly precise clarity. Walking to that bedroom window and looking at exactly where the killer had climbed through, and then walking further into the apartment and finding 2 children still asleep, entirely unaware, while their mother lay dead with a coat hanger wound around her neck. Pickett and his team worked the apartment meticulously, collecting everything they could, dusting for prints across virtually every surface, including the floor itself. On the windowsill where the killer had entered, Pickett lifted a partial palm print. It was, at the time, simply one more piece of physical evidence in an active homicide investigation. Nobody in that apartment in September of 1981 could have known that this single print, sitting in an evidence file for the better part of 4 decades, would eventually be the detail that finally closed this case. An autopsy confirmed what the crime scene had already suggested. Linda had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. Investigators collected a rape kit, preserving biological evidence from the assault. Evidence that, in 1981, could tell detectives comparatively little on its own. DNA profiling, as a forensic tool, was still years away from being developed at all, let alone from becoming a standard part of criminal investigation. What Sergeant Pickett's team was doing, in effect, was preserving evidence for a future they had no way of predicting, trusting that science would eventually catch up to what they couldn't yet prove. And there was something else the crime scene made clear from the very start, something that would matter enormously decades later, once a suspect finally had a name and a defense to offer. This hadn't been a consensual encounter that had simply gone wrong. Investigators found evidence from the scene that a foreign object had been used during the assault, and Linda's body showed lacerations consistent with a genuine physical struggle to get the wire hanger off her own neck. Whatever had happened inside that bedroom, the physical evidence made clear that Linda Slaten had fought for her life. Part 4. A cold case. Investigators in 1981 worked through a substantial list of potential suspects, including people close to Linda's own life, her ex-husband among them. None of it led anywhere conclusive. Without a DNA match to compare against, and without any witness or confession to point them in a definitive direction, the case against Linda Slaten's killer began to stall. It would go on stalling for the better part of 40 years. By the late 1990s, forensic DNA technology had finally advanced far enough that investigators were able to build a genetic profile from the evidence preserved in Linda's rape kit all those years earlier. A profile of an unknown male waiting to be matched against a name. Police ran that profile against law enforcement databases. Nothing came back. Whoever had killed Linda Slaten had never been arrested for any offense serious enough to have their DNA collected and logged into the system. The case grew. In the language investigators themselves often use for cases like this, cold, the kind of cold that starts to make even experienced detectives quietly wonder whether the person responsible might already be dead, whether justice in any conventional sense might simply no longer be reachable. For Linda's sons, meanwhile, this wasn't a case file sitting in a records room. It was the defining, unresolved trauma of both of their childhoods. Jeff, who had been 15 when his mother was killed, has since spoken about assuming, for most of his adult life, that he would take his last breath without ever knowing who had done this to his mother. Tim, who'd been only 12, has described a fear that followed him for decades. The particular, corrosive fear of knowing that whoever killed his mother might still be out there, might even be someone he knew personally, someone he might have crossed paths with at any point in the years since. That fear, it would eventually turn out, was justified in a way almost nobody could have anticipated. Part 5. The man behind them throughout the years following Linda's murder, both before and after. Joseph Mills remained a consistent, ordinary presence in Tim's life through their shared connection to youth football. He continued, by multiple accounts, to periodically ask Tim how the investigation into his mother's murder was progressing. Was there any news? Any new leads? It's a genuinely chilling detail once you understand the full context. A man who knew exactly what had happened to Linda Slaten, because he was the one responsible, casually checking in with her 12-year-old son about the status of the police investigation into his own crime, using a child's natural desire for answers as a way of quietly monitoring how close investigators were getting to him. For years, the team photo stayed up on Tim's bedroom wall, Coach Joe standing proudly behind him, a memento of a relationship Tim had genuinely valued. It's the kind of detail that, once the truth eventually surfaced, becomes almost unbearable to think about. A child's innocent pride in a mentor relationship, unknowingly memorializing the exact moment and the exact man responsible for the worst thing that had ever happened to his family. Part 6. A breakthrough 4 decades in the making. The technology that would eventually crack this case open didn't exist in any meaningful form until relatively recently. Forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had, by the late 2010s, already begun transforming how cold cases across the United States were being solved. The method works by taking preserved DNA evidence, like the sample sitting, still carefully stored in Linda Slaten's decades-old rape kit, and uploading a processed profile of it to public genetic genealogy databases, the same kind of platforms ordinary people use to research their own family trees. From there, genetic genealogists work outward from whatever distant familial matches turn up, painstakingly constructing broader family trees using birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, and increasingly, public social media profiles, gradually narrowing an enormous pool of possible relatives down toward a single, specific person. In 2018, investigators working Linda's case brought in genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, who had already built a reputation as one of the leading practitioners of exactly this kind of work. Moore uploaded the DNA profile developed from evidence preserved at Linda's crime scene to GEDmatch, one of the genealogy platforms most commonly used in cold case investigations, and got to work. Within days, she began constructing a substantial family tree, tracing distant genetic relatives across generations. Piece by piece, cross-referencing what she found against public records, that tree began to narrow. And eventually, it pointed toward one specific name, Joseph Clinton Mills. For investigators, that name would have carried an especially strange, specific weight, because Mills wasn't a total stranger dredged up from an anonymous DNA database. He was a known figure connected to this family for decades, a man who had spent years as a presence in young Tim Slaten's life, someone who had, by all appearances, remained on friendly terms with the very family whose matriarch he was now suspected of murdering. Investigators moved to confirm what the genealogical work had suggested. They obtained a sample connected to Mills and compared it against both the DNA evidence from the rape kit and, crucially, against that decades-old palm print Sergeant Edgar Pickett had lifted from Linda's windowsill back in 1981. A print that had also, separately, been connected to Mills through fingerprints collected during an unrelated prior arrest. The two pieces of evidence, collected 38 years apart using entirely different forensic methods, pointed to the exact same man. Part 7. The arrest and the account. In late 2019, Joseph Clinton Mills was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary with assault, in connection with the 1981 death of Linda Slaten. When investigators finally interviewed him about that night, decades after the fact, Mills offered an account of events that, on its face, attempted to reframe what had happened as something other than a violent crime. According to court documents summarizing his statement, Mills claimed that Linda had invited him to engage in what he described as wild sex, and that upon entering her bedroom, he'd found her already wearing a wire hanger around her own neck as she lay on the bed. From there, according to his own account, he twisted that hanger tighter and tighter around her neck while engaging in sexual intercourse with her until she lost consciousness. He told police he then left through the same window he'd entered by. It's an account that asks investigators, and eventually a court, to believe that Linda Slaten had voluntarily initiated an extreme and specific act of erotic asphyxiation with a man who had, by his own admission, been dropping her son off from football practice only hours earlier, and that whatever happened afterward had simply, tragically, gone further than intended. The physical evidence collected from the scene in 1981 told a very different story. Investigators had already established, through the original autopsy and crime scene analysis, that a foreign object had been used during the assault, a detail entirely absent from and unexplained by Mills's account of consensual, wild sex. And Linda's body had shown lacerations consistent with a genuine, desperate struggle to remove the hanger from her own neck. Not the kind of injury pattern typically associated with a consensual act, but the unmistakable physical record of a woman fighting for her life against someone actively trying to kill her. Whatever Joseph Mills wanted investigators, and later a court, to believe about that night, the evidence gathered by Sergeant Pickett and his team nearly 4 decades earlier had already, patiently, been waiting to contradict him. Part 8. Facing the family, the case moved through the Florida court system over the following 2 years. In 2022, Joseph Mills changed his plea to guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary with assault and battery. Avoiding a trial that his own attorneys presumably recognized would be exceptionally difficult to win, given the combination of DNA evidence, the palm print match, and the forensic details that so thoroughly contradicted his account of events. At his sentencing hearing, Jeff and Tim Slaten, along with other family members including Linda's sister Judy Butler and one of Linda's granddaughters, were given the opportunity to speak directly to the man who had spent nearly 40 years as a trusted, familiar presence in their lives, all while carrying the secret of what he'd done to their mother. They asked him directly, in that courtroom, why he had done it, why he had killed her. Joseph Mills did not respond to any of their questions. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Given the choice, the Slaten family has since said they would have preferred the case go to trial, specifically for the possibility of a punishment by death. A preference that speaks to just how much pain and anger nearly 40 years of unanswered questions had left behind. Instead, they were left with a guilty plea, a silent defendant, and life sentences that would keep Joseph Mills behind bars for whatever remained of his life, without ever forcing him to explain himself. Part 9. What the photo means now in the years since Mills's arrest and conviction. Tim Slaten has spoken publicly about what it means to look back now at that old football team photo, the one he was once so proud to hang on his bedroom wall, Coach Joe standing directly behind him, smiling for the camera. He's described it now as something that genuinely sickens him, a memento of childhood pride and trust, permanently reframed by the knowledge of exactly who that man was, and exactly what he'd done to Tim's mother before that photo was ever taken. It's one of the quieter, more devastating threads running through this entire case. The specific, compounded cruelty of Joseph Mills continuing to insert himself into Tim's life for years after the murder, asking a child about the progress of the investigation into his own crime, allowing himself to be photographed as a trusted mentor, standing behind the very boy whose mother he had killed. Whatever else this case is about, DNA science, genetic genealogy, 4 decades of patient, unresolved grief, it's also, unavoidably, about the particular betrayal of a man who spent years hiding in plain sight, inside the family he'd already devastated. Jeff Slaten, reflecting on the case after Mills's sentencing, said something that captures, about as honestly as anyone could, what nearly 40 years of not knowing does to a person, and what finally knowing does and doesn't fix. He wasn't sure, he said, if there was really such a thing as closure. But it had gotten easier, he said, knowing that Mills was finally locked up. Linda Patterson Slaten was 31 years old. She was raising 2 boys largely on her own, doing the best she could with what she had, in a life that wasn't easy, but that she was building with real determination. She never got to see her sons grow up. She never got to learn that the answer to the question that would define both of their childhoods, who did this to our mother, had been standing behind one of them in a football photo the whole time. It took a torn window screen, a coat hanger from her own closet, a partial palm print preserved for 38 years, and a piece of technology nobody in 1981 could have imagined to finally bring her sons an answer. It will never bring them, their mother, back. But after 4 decades of not knowing, it gave them, at last, a name. Thank you for listening.